Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Injustice Podcast. I'm your host, David Greenwald. For the past 10 years, we've operated Vanguard court watches in California, including San Francisco, Sacramento, and Yolo counties. Our goal? Expose everyday court injustices, and now, more broadly, shine a spotlight on injustices in the entire criminal justice system, in the form of wrongful convictions, police and prosecutorial misconduct, and mass incarceration. This podcast hopes to take it a step further and highlight criminal justice reform on a national level.
Everyday injustice.
I have here Steph Liebb. He's working with the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, and next month we are honoring him as one of our formerly incarcerated. Welcome to our show, Steph.
Thank you so much, David. I'm honored to be here as well.
So, tell us a bit about your story and how you got here.
Well, I was incarcerated 32 years in CDC, and I was convicted of a first-degree murder. I went to the parole board multiple times during the era when there was a no parole policy, and I even won relief from the federal court at a time when they were entertaining challenges to the parole board before the Cook decision, which basically told the federal courts to stay out of the parole board's business, that there was no federally protected liberty interest in parole. But Judge Claudia Wilkin had basically essentially ordered my release, but that decision was appealed to the Ninth Circuit. This was around 2009, and it took me another 4 years to get back to the board and be found suitable. And I was fortunate to be paroled on October 30th, 2013. So I'm approaching that anniversary. And how I got to work in the public defender's office was a journey. And, I'd worked with organizations that help formerly incarcerated, like the Asian Prisoner Support Committee in Oakland. And I'd also found some intern for almost the whole time before I was hired in 2018 by the Public Defender's Office. I had interned with the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at UC Hastings. And I had found that position through Professor Melissa Nelkin, who taught a class in mediation and negotiation at San Quentin. And when she found out that I was going home, she offered to help me find employment. But she had spoken about the work of the refugee clinic in establishing a rudimentary legal system in Haiti. And because most of my homeboys in prison were refugees from Southeast Asia, I felt that I wanted to do this type of work that once I started working for pay, it would be too enticing and I wouldn't find an opportunity to volunteer. So I spent several years working on country conditions reports and doing research under Karen Musolo, Blaine Bookie, and other wonderful lawyers at UC Hastings. And they basically taught me how to use the internet, how to do research. So I'm grateful for the experience. I interviewed for the Public Defender's Office as a legal assistant, which is essentially a paralegal. And my first interview was with Kathy Asada, and Jacques Wilson, two people I respect greatly. And they pushed me through to the next level where Jeff Adachi, may he rest in peace, and Matt Gonzalez interviewed me. And I was blessed to be hired. And most of my work there has been on post-conviction, first with Jacques Wilson on mostly 1437 cases, which was incredibly rewarding. I actually represented people I had done time with who thought they recognized me from the yard. And now I work with the best attorney in that office, in my estimation, Danielle Harris, and on the Freedom Project. And we're a small but growing team. And together we've done some really wonderful work, freeing people with life sentences, some with non-life commitments. But for me, it's the lifers, some of whom were incarcerated for over 30 years, with most of the time spent in the SHU, getting them released. That's been, I guess for me, a form of making living amends, which is something that was part of my parole plans. And, I look occasionally when I'm feeling slightly discontented, I remind myself where I've been, and having the perspective that I don't wake up in a cell. It makes everything so much brighter. And I actually had my parole date rescinded by the governor when it was granted, and Charles Carbone filed a writ on my behalf and won in the Superior Court. And to my surprise, it wasn't appealed, and I got to go home. But because my date was taken, I had actually been meeting with an attorney from a clinic at UC Davis, a law student who was going to represent me. And I was scheduled for a board hearing. And I keep that paper to remind me that I could still be going to the board, because I'll be out going 9 years this October. And there's still folks that I was on the yard with that are still going to the parole board. So I don't take my freedom for granted.
So I want to kind of backtrack a little bit. And how did you get into the situation where you ended up, with the first degree murder? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I was living in Los Angeles, and I was young, I was immature, and I didn't have good anger management skills or impulse control. And I allowed conflict to escalate to a point where I picked up a knife and I stabbed my victim. And I want to emphasize that there's no justification for my acts, that my victim's family, they still live with the pain. And being connected now to my family out here, it kind of deepens my understanding of the impact of the loss of a loved one. So I know in defense work, in the public defender's office, our focus is on defense and those who are accused. For me, though, I remain cognizant and have a deep awareness of the suffering of victims.
And can you also describe how you got from the point at which you were convicted to the point where you could actually be released? I mean, what was that process like for you?
Well, I'm going to speed forward to the day I paroled, where they woke me up early to go to receiving and release. And I went there, and I was the only lifer paroling. It was a bunch of what we call short timers. And you sit in a cage, but it's not like the feeling when you first arrive at a prison, sitting in a holding cage. And I was really patient, and reminded myself, don't rush this. And I really wanted to be present for it, for everything. And it was a very slow process. Like, there was no need for me to be awoken at like 4:30 in the morning, because I didn't leave till about, I imagine, after 8 o'clock. But, you get processed out, get put on a van, and you pass the same yard where I ran laps every day and exercised and walked. And then there's multiple checks. And I remember thinking, this is so easy. This is so easy. What took me so long? What took 32 years? But what took so long for me was I was in prison, and I started out in Old Folsom, which is a level 4. And my first day on the main line, I saw somebody stabbed to death under a bench pressing. And it was such a stark environment, like reminded me of a medieval castle. And I remember thinking to myself, and I was in my early 20s, I'm not going to live long, but I'm just going to do my time the right way. And there was no hope for release. And from Folsom, I went to other prisons. I ultimately was put in administrative segregation on charges that were ultimately dropped, and I served about 3 years in Corcoran SHU. So I came out of the SHU with a really bitter attitude towards CDC, and but I felt like powerless to fight them. Although while I was in the hole, I did help people file administrative appeals. I did testify in federal court in Sacramento for the prison law office in a lawsuit about mistreatment of AIDS and handicapped patients, which was part of the reason I was put in the hole, was because I was helping someone who worked in the clinic address the mistreatment of people with needs for physical therapy that weren't being given to them. When I was in the administrative segregation unit in the California Medical Facility, Willis Unit, I saw people missing limbs who weren't given their prostheses. The beds there were concrete slabs, so they had no way of getting off of them, and they had bed sores. So when I was put in an administrative detention cell, which is a punishment cell within the hole, which is designed for a stay of only up to 10 days. And it can only be extended if there's approval by a chief psychiatrist and the director of corrections. Those were the rules at the time. But they kept me there 51 consecutive days, complete isolation, no property. And fortuitously, the prison law office was conducting a tour. And you could recognize when you're incarcerated who's CDC and who's a civilian. So I was able to get at them, and they took my name and my cell number, and they tried to visit me, but were told I refused to visit. But they wrote to me, and ultimately we met. I met with Millard Murphy, and I testified in federal court in Sacramento. I was able to help a couple of lifers gain acquittals on murder convictions because I'd witnessed contamination of evidence and the provision of favors to inmate informants. So I testified for the defense in their trial. So I became an enemy of CDCR while I was in administrative segregation. So they transported me, special transport, to Corcoran SHU. The times when I returned out to court, I was put back in Willis Unit, and basically, I participated in nonviolent protests, like refusing to lock up while we were on the yard. And, ultimately they flew me in an airplane from Nut Tree Airport in Vacaville to Hanford Airport in Shoe. And they put a lot of stuff, what they call in my jacket. Your jacket is your prison file. They said I was very assaultive to staff. So I was basically most of my time in Corcoran, I was in not only waist chains, but leg shackles whenever I was escorted. I was there during the era of the gladiator fights. And, they try to put you in provocative situations on yards. But, I was blessed that I never had any kind of problems with anybody, and I look back on that now, like my survival. I have a homeboy I did time with, not in the Shoe in Corcoran, but we did a lot of years together in San Quentin. And he lives in San Francisco. And I said, Rico, it's just amazing. Like, we used to kick it in the chow hall. We worked in the kitchen in San Quentin together. We used to kick it there. And now we're both out here kicking it in Yerba Buena. And it's just amazing how we survived, because the era when I was in prison and like today, it was very violent, particularly the Shoe. So how I got here, like for me, to just be straight up with you, it's my higher power. Like, I can't attribute it to, being extra tough or smart. I was the first timer going in, and I came in with no tattoos. I don't have any now. And I was able to program my last year as a Quentin with the Asian and Pacific Islanders, but I was embraced by the Northern Mexicans. I celled with BGF and Black Muslims. So I was able to, in a very racialized environment, I was able to transcend those lines. And there, a lot of people say it's impossible. Well, it's difficult, but, I know it's not impossible. And it's not that I didn't ever have conflicts, but for the most part, I was able to avoid them. And just living and breathing, for me, it's a miracle when I really think about it, Dave.
Sounds like it. So, and it sounds almost like a miracle that you were able to land where you did after you got released, because so many people struggle after, 32 years of being incarcerated. And you were able to, I would think, end up in the perfect place, right?
Well, I want to say this to anybody who has a loved one who's incarcerated, who's going to come out, hopefully one day, or if not soon, or to anyone who's formerly incarcerated. Hey, it was a struggle for me. I have a younger brother who works in the financial markets, and we were close. And when I came out, like, I talked to him, and I tell him, I say, hey, the stress out here, it's unbelievable, and he said, but everything you went through. I said, it's real easy in there. It's black and white. You only have a few decisions to make. Like, it was overwhelming for me. I remember, like, going with my niece to get her a smoothie in Oakland, and I was all frazzled. I couldn't figure out where the line was. And I'm so sensitive with prison culture, not cutting in front of the line or disrespecting anybody like it was a major thing. I said, no, that's not the line. They weren't here before us. And just all those kind of adjustments, getting where, no matter what you make, unless you're in that top echelon in the Bay, it's tough out here, just the rents, the cost of living. So Yeah, I'd rather have those problems. I'm grateful for these problems, but it wasn't an immediate type of success. And even to this day, like, I don't take it for granted. That's why, like, there's a part of uneasiness, like being recognized and getting honored, because I have homeboys who did life sentences that were so solid in there and for a little while out here, and they're back in again as lifers. So I don't take it for granted, and all I could say is that one quality, like, I will recognize in myself is perseverance. I was part of the 1,000-mile club in there, and I completed a few marathons, won one in there. After my time, there were much, much, much faster runners that came along. But running 105 laps around that track, it takes a certain mindset. And, I also was part of the prison yoga project, and I actually attended at least a couple of classes a week. I was invited to the regular class and a veterans class in H unit. So yoga was real helpful in basically learning how to stay in uncomfortable positions and not reacting, which is a real useful skill everywhere.
I'll bet.
And so there were things. I had an education in prison, and it was a good education in dealing with difficult situations, difficult people, unreasonable people, not all of them in green, but at most. So, a lot of things, I do encounter things that test my patience. I'm human. And a lot of things that people get bothered by are nothing to me, So I wouldn't wish them to go through incarceration, but it kind of, I think for most, especially lifers, it inures us to a lot of the little vicissitudes and the little discomforts of daily life.
So talk about some of the things that you've done since you've gotten out. Maybe, highlight a few things that really stand out to you.
It's going to be surprising to you what comes to my mind, but for me, it was participating in the Oakland Marathon as part of a relay team with the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. A couple of times running different like 5-6 mile legs, like the friendship, the fellowship, the training. And then another year I did the half marathon and ran the 5K with my niece, who was like about 9 then. So they have a special event called Run the Town, and just running with my niece, participating with Community Youth Center in San Francisco in my first and only dragon boat race, and training on Lake Mead, doing something new. Really, and I've expressed this like to Danielle and some folks on the Freedom Project team, like the most wonderful part of freedom are things I never thought about in there. Like I came out, I had a 5-year-old niece, Eliza. Now I have a 2-year-old niece, Eliana, and just seeing the world through their eyes and going to the park with them, playing tag, seeing my Eliana on a balance bike. It's just, it takes all kind of stress and anxiety away from me. And going through this COVID the last 2 or so years, I remember I was I used to go the office had a yoga class twice a week. Teachers came in, but when it was canceled, sometimes I'd go to a class at Yoga to the People on 16th Street before that was shut down. And I remember I was trying to go to a class, and that's when the city announced the shutdown. And it was like reminiscent of when they recall the yard in prison, and you're going on lockdown. And they said, like, remember it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve. So I said, damn, like there's like a lockdown. And in prison, if there's a lockdown, but like you're a kitchen worker and your ethnic, they call it race. If your race isn't locked down, you go to work, which is nice, not to be stuck in the cell. So I was saying, man, I hope I'm not stuck, in the apartment. I could get out to work. And but just my sister was pregnant during that time, and I had to isolate from my family because of this COVID. So like that brought back a lot of emotions from prison, just the isolation, at the peak of this.
Yeah.
So experiencing that again and trying to find the discipline I had in there to build a program, when most everything was shut down. I guess that's what stands out. But as far as the work, it's any time that someone goes home. I mean, we've had some really, people denied by the board like over 10, 12 times. And I know the board's never going to let them out because the board has no mercy. It's a gentler, kinder board now. They don't call you a liar. They don't disrespect you, but they'll deny you unless you fit their criteria. And there's some folks that, they came in with substance abuse problems. They never got addressed in the disciplinary history, their inability to articulate insight into their commitment offense to the board's satisfaction. You could pretty much tell that they're not going to make it out through the board. Some of them in their 70s, even 80s. So when we're able to get them out through resentencing, that's another miracle. And just giving people an opportunity to experience this freedom like I have. And I talked to Danielle today, and there's some clients who just got out, and their little warning signs, they might be returning to the gang life. And ultimately, I said, hey, you can't control anybody else. You gave them the chance. And I heard Judge Conroy did a couple of resentencing of lifers who did like 30 years, around that range, give them a little lecture before he cut them loose, saying, he might have even been in court for some of these where he said, this is the first day of the rest of your life, and it's up to you what you do with it. And it might have seemed a little stern, but I imagine for the person on the precipice of going home, they just felt relief, and those words didn't sting, and they might have been a good reminder, because although the stats, the recidivism for lifers is very low, but there are, if you look at the board hearing schedules, there are hearings for folks that have been lifers that have been violated, and once you go back in, it's very, very hard to get out again because the board feels that you fooled them. And then the perception on the yard is you had a chance and you blew it. You're making it harder for me to get out now. And I could recall when I was behind the walls, like certain cases, like the polyclass case, Richard Allen Davis, there's among a lot of prisoners, there's a resentment. Like, you just made it hard for everybody. And, now with this new regime, with the DA and a governor with presidential ambitions, it's starting to tighten up a little as far as resentencing and pardons. I had a homeboy who was still in there when I paroled and finally got a date, got paroled to ICE custody, and they put him on a plane to Cambodia a few weeks ago. The governor wouldn't pardon him. And he never spent a day in Cambodia, doesn't speak the language. So things are changing, not for the better.
So we're almost out of time here, but can you describe a little bit what the Freedom Project is?
Sure. The Freedom Project works on all types and forms of post-conviction relief, whether it's under the various penal codes for resentencing, like now 1172.6, 1170.03, general resentencing, whether it's getting rid of enhancements that are now discretionary, and even providing preparation and representation at parole hearings in certain cases. So it's basically about getting people out of prison. And then the other part is through really talented reentry specialists and social workers on our team, making sure that they not only could succeed out here, but thrive by getting them placed into housing that's not another form of jail like 1170 Taylor, providing them every resource that we can access for them.
And then one final question, and I got to ask, what was it like working with Jeff Adachi?
I could tell you what it was. I worked with him on jury instructions for one case. So I can't really comment on working with him, which would have been a great honor and privilege, but I could tell you about being interviewed by him. And, I'm not name dropping, but I met with in person Alan Dershowitz, Gerald Ullman, top lawyers at Fryer Margolin, legends in the legal field, James Brosnahan from Morrison and Forster. And he is the sharpest attorney I ever met. And just a quick example, he was asking me about anything creative or innovative I did working in law out here. And I said, yeah, I used a duress defense on someone with a DUI because the cop told them to move the car. Well, and then charge them. And he says, do you know the elements of the duress defense? And I did not, but he had them at his fingertip. And he was an incredibly charismatic, creative individual. And, it was a loss, of course, first for his family, but also for the public defender's office and the community, because he was a champion for the powerless.
Well, I want to thank you, Steph, for sharing your story. It's an incredible story, and I unfortunately feel like in the half an hour that we had, we're not doing it justice, but at least people get a little bit of sense for what you've been through and what you're doing.
Hey, thank you so much, Dave. You have a wonderful weekend, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.